Hello, students, faculty, and friends of Hillsdale College. My name is Mariah Hardy. I'm from the great state of Oregon, and I am a junior here at Hillsdale studying international business and German. I'm involved on campus in my sorority, Chi Omega, and as a student ambassador for Hillsdale College admissions. Today, I have the honor of introducing you to Mr. Peter Schiff. Peter Schiff is the CEO and Chief Global Strategist of Euro-Pacific Capital. He earned a degree in finance and accounting from UC Berkeley in 1987. Mr. Schiff served as an economic advisor to Ron Paul in the 2008 presidential campaign. He is widely quoted in numerous publications, including the Wall Street Journal, Barron's, Investors Business Daily, the Financial Times, the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, and the Washington Post. He's a frequent guest on CNBC, CNN, Fox News, and the Fox Business Network. Mr. Schiff is the author of numerous books, including How an Economy Grows and Why It Crashes, Crash Proof, How to Profit from the Coming Economic Collapse, and, most recently, The Real Crash, America's Coming Bankruptcy, How to Save Yourself and Your Country. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Peter Schiff.
A lot of steps over there. You know, it's a little bit of an old intro. I wonder if I need to update that, because, you know, I used to be a frequent guest on all those media outlets. But now, I don't know, maybe I'm an infrequent guest. I'm on once in a while. I'm on television more often outside the United States than inside the United States. I think I got too many things right to be invited back. And I guess that's a good lead into the topic. I read the topic of my talk on the plane on the way over here. So I'm talking about the Fed and what we're supposed to think of it. And, you know, I mean, it's really like, you know, like from Star Wars, right? What are the bad guys? You know, well, not that. No, that's Star Trek. That's Star Trek. Whatever, the evil empire, whatever, the Death Star. I mean, the Federal Reserve is a very bad organization, a very evil entity. I think that most of the problems, most of the problems that we have can be laid at the foot of the Federal Reserve. I mean, not that the Federal Reserve acts, you know, as the sole source of our problems. But most of the problems could really be traced to the Federal Reserve. I mean, the Federal Reserve is certainly responsible for, I think, the degradation of the American economy, the artificially low interest rates that have prevailed, you know, for most of the last probably 20 years. I mean, particularly the last 7 years, they're at zero now. But even prior to that, the Federal Reserve has been artificially suppressing interest rates, just, you know, price fixing the cost of credit, with disastrous consequences for the real economy. I think as a result of what the Fed has done, the Fed has discouraged and undermined capital investment, savings, you know, legitimate investment, production, and the other side, they have encouraged and subsidized reckless consumption, speculation. All of this has helped transform the American economy from an industrial powerhouse to the world's largest debtor nation. And we exist basically as this supposed consumer-based economy where all we do is buy things that are made in other countries and borrow the money in order to do it. And what the Fed has created in replace of the economy they've helped destroy is a gigantic bubble. And yes, they've been able to elevate the stock market, and they've been able to elevate the bond market and the real estate market and rare art and collectible automobiles, and all sorts of asset prices have gone way up. But at the same time, they have been the principal, I think, architect of this widening divide between the very rich and everybody else, particularly what used to be the American middle class and the lower class. And in fact, that's helping to fuel a lot of this class warfare, where members of what used to be the middle class and the lower classes are taking out their anger and their frustration at what they perceive to be the source of their problem, not recognizing. I was just at an event in Jackson Hole. Did anybody go to that event? Yeah, it was. The Federal Reserve meets every year in Jackson Hole, and it's a very big televised conference, And I was there to participate in a very critical event, critical of the Federal Reserve, right? And so it was a protest event, and I was one of the speakers. Well, there was another organization that was there criticizing the Fed, Black Lives Matter. And they were there to demand that the Fed not raise interest rates. And, I think the Federal Reserve really encouraged this protest, maybe behind the scenes, because the event that I was at tried to book the same venue, the same hotel where the Fed was meeting. And they were told, no, you can't be in this hotel. It's only for the Fed. And so they had to have a place a couple miles down the road. This organization was in the same location as the Fed. And they came up with the idea a lot, later than the organization I was speaking at. So I think the Federal Reserve had something to do. I think they liked this protest because the protest basically validated everything the Fed was doing, because the protesters who had been bussed in by the labor unions, they hadn't even heard of the Fed until they showed up, right? But the protesters had these signs that people had written for them, and they said, there's what inflation? There's no inflation. We need jobs. Don't raise rates. And the whole idea was that somehow what the Fed is doing is creating jobs, is growing the economy, and the protesters don't want the Fed to stop doing all this good stuff, as if somehow just creating money, printing money, right, taking paper and putting numbers on it, and somehow doing this is going to generate economic prosperity, economic growth, and that we need inflation. In fact, I was reading this article just this morning, and it was an article that was quoting me, but the headline didn't quote me. I had said some negative comments about the economy, and the headline in the article was, "Consumers feel the sting of low inflation." Feel the sting of low inflation? So let me get this. So a consumer is showing up at a store, and it's like, oh my gosh, I thought this was going to be more expensive. It's cheaper than I thought. This really stings. What am I going to do with this extra money that I didn't spend? This feeling is, I was talking about how the economy was weak, but the Federal Reserve has been able to succeed with their propaganda effort to convince everybody that inflation is a good thing, and their job is to create it. Right? How's that for a 180, right? Because people used to say, the Federal Reserve is here to fight inflation. Now they're here to create inflation, to fight the absence of inflation. Right? They used to say, we want price stability. Well, price stability means no inflation. Now they've redefined price stability to prices rising by at least 2% a year. And if they're not rising by at least that much, we have to take decisive action to make sure that prices go up. Because somehow if prices don't go up, right, then the economy is going to implode into some kind of vortex, right? And so this is the propaganda effort that the Federal Reserve has been able to successfully, indoctrinate almost the entire world at this point into believing that a rising cost of living is an economic necessity, that somehow if the cost of living were to go down, that we would all suffer as a result of that. So the Federal Reserve has been the main, barrier to economic growth, to progress. Yes, the federal government is also complicit, but if it wasn't for the Fed, if the Federal Reserve wasn't willing to accommodate all this government spending, by monetizing it, and by keeping interest rates artificially low, the government would have had to come to terms with its insolvency years ago. The government would have been forced to cut spending years ago had the Federal Reserve not cooperated, not kept interest rates artificially low. So if you're upset about big government and the growth of government, look no further than the Federal Reserve, because the Federal Reserve is enabling it to happen. And the Fed pretends like, hey, we've got no choice here. We just have to accommodate the government. No, they don't. The whole idea behind the Federal Reserve is that it's supposed to be independent, but they don't act independent at all. They act like a branch of the government, an arm of the federal government, and they're there to facilitate government spending and government deficits. But the problem is, because of what the Federal Reserve has done, the deficits have been able to grow to levels that never could have existed. In fact, when they first started the Federal Reserve in 1913, the Federal Reserve was not even allowed to buy U.S. government debt. Right? The people that created the Federal Reserve were smart enough to say, look, we don't want the government to be able to borrow from the Federal Reserve. We don't want that to happen. Right? And so that was not part of the Federal Reserve's mission. And they probably wouldn't even be able to get the votes to create it if it was going to be an engine of inflation. But what happened, as often is the case, is we got ourselves into World War I. And whenever we end up getting in war, all of a sudden governments usurp a lot of power that during peacetime the public would never allow them to take. But once you get a war and all of a sudden it's patriotism, well, the government is able to use that to do all sorts of very unpatriotic things, and they're able to get away with it because, it's a war. And so one of the things that happened in a war is they amended the Federal Reserve Act to enable the Federal Reserve to buy U.S. Treasuries. They weren't allowed to do it before. Why? Because the government wanted to finance the war. And that made it easier. Now, another thing that just happened, right, it was that the Congress unfortunately voted to suspend the debt ceiling. They used to raise the debt ceiling. Now they just eliminate it for a period of time, right? They don't even have the integrity to raise it because they're embarrassed about putting a new number, right? So they just suspend it every once in a while so they don't have to be accused of raising it, right? Instead of, voting, to leave it where it is. But the reason we even have a debt ceiling in the first place is because when the Federal Reserve Act was amended, in order to enable the government to borrow from the Fed and the Fed to buy treasuries, Congress was worried that this relationship could result in too much debt, that the government would take advantage of this, and so they passed a debt ceiling. They said, okay, we're going to make a ceiling here and say, look, this is the highest, this is the most debt we're going to allow. That was part of the whole process. Well, obviously it didn't work. The ceiling should have been a constitutional amendment or something. It should have been, a ceiling that could never go up. But unfortunately, that ceiling has been raised every time it's been approached, until just recently when it's just been suspended. But because of the Federal Reserve, the government is enormous. The government never could have grown to the size that it is if it had to pay for its activities with real money. If it actually had to tax the citizens for all of the spending, the citizens would have objected to the spending. People want something for nothing. They don't want something if they have to pay for it, right? But the government was able to promise something for nothing. But all this is from the Fed. And I think because of the Fed, the United States today is on the verge of the biggest economic catastrophe in the history of the country. And, if you thought the 2008 financial crisis was bad, that's nothing compared to what's coming. That was just the warm-up, right? The main event is still coming. And because of what the Federal Reserve did in the aftermath of that crisis to make all the problems that caused the crisis worse, it's going to be so much worse when we actually have to deal with the real economic crisis that is still coming. And what's going to really exacerbate it is that the Federal Reserve still doesn't understand its role in causing that problem. To this day, Ben Bernanke, and he's going around promoting his book, right? He's got a new book out, the Courage to Act. I mean, how much courage does it take to print money, right? The real title of the book should be A Coward's Way Out. And in fact, when I see it, you see that book, it's in the airport bookstore too. If you see that book on a shelf, move it to the fiction section, because that's where it belongs, right? But he's out there promoting his book like he saved the country, right? And I talked to him. I ran into him at a conference in Las Vegas where we were both speaking. I spoke for free. He got $250,000 to speak. But anyway, so we're speaking at this investment conference, and I got up. I talked to him at a cocktail party about the crisis, and the guy is still so clueless about the Fed. He thinks that the Federal Reserve's 1% interest rates had nothing to do with the housing bubble. Nothing. It was just a sheer random coincidence that we had a housing bubble and we happen to have these 1% interest rates. Right? Well, it wasn't a coincidence, because the minute the Fed lowered interest rates to 1% in 2002, I began warning that this was going to produce a disaster. And by 2004, I knew exactly what the disaster was, and I started writing. I started going around the country talking. I was, going on television, talking about the housing bubble, about how the Federal Reserve had created that bubble, and what the consequences were going to be for the economy when the bubble burst. So I knew about the bubble because I understood the Fed was causing it. The same time that I was out there warning about a bubble, people like Ben Bernanke and Janet Yellen were denying that a housing bubble existed. Even after it burst, these guys were denying. Even Janet Yellen, when Janet Yellen was appointed chairman of the Federal Reserve, right, everybody said, she is the brightest one on the Fed because she was the one that was warning about the housing bubble, and nobody listened to her. And, if we only had Janet Yellen at the helm, everything would have been great. I mean, even President Obama said this when he appointed her during the press conference. She warned about the crisis. Right? Well, I actually did a little research on it, and I find out that she didn't warn about anything. In fact, the very speeches where Janet Yellen is credited for having warned, I went back and read those speeches. And not only did she not warn about anything, she actually said that the people who were worried about the housing market were wrong. She said there was no housing bubble, that housing prices reflected the fundamentals, and even as late as 2006, she expected housing prices to keep rising. And she said if she's wrong, if I end up being wrong and housing prices go down, it's not going to hurt the economy. That's how she was, as clueless as you could possibly be. I did a YouTube video, Janet Yellen Exposed. So if you want to, if you have some time, you want to watch that video, you can actually, I highlight all the things that she said. She was as clueless as you can be. So now, it's the blind leading the blind, having Janet Yellen. And she was the president of the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco during the entire bubble. Right? I mean, California was, one of the biggest problem areas. California, that area, and Las Vegas. So she was right there and had no idea. So the Federal Reserve is completely clueless about how its very policies caused the 2008 financial crisis. And now they've pursued the same policies on steroids. Right? If you can remember what happened in 2008, right? All the bad things that were supposedly about to happen. That resulted from the Federal Reserve keeping interest rates at 1% for, less than 2 years, a year and a half. And then the Federal Reserve raised interest rates in a measured pace, which was every time they met, they hiked them 1/4 of a point. So it took another year and a half to get interest rates back up to 5%, where they were before the Fed slashed them to 1%. And so it was during that 3 years, really, that the biggest part of the damage was done. That's when most of the subprime loans were taken out, the adjustable rate mortgages, the no doc, the interest only. I mean, all this was facilitated by the cheap money that was supplied by the Federal Reserve. And of course, once they got the speculative mania going, it just fed on itself, right? But they lit the sparks with that policy. And we had all this malinvestment that took place because interest rates were too low. Well, if the Fed did all that damage by keeping interest rates at 1% and then raising them back to 5% slowly, imagine the degree of damage that has been done over the last 7 years, where interest rates have been at zero the entire time. And the Fed has tripled its balance sheet. How much more screwed up is the economy now than it was in 2008 before the crisis? And the crisis is the way the market tries to repair all the problems that the Fed has created. Right? Well, there's a lot more problems now. The country is so much more indebted. The structure of the economy is so much more screwed up. And Janet Yellen isn't even talking about raising interest rates back up to normal. Even if the Fed raises interest rates in December, which I still don't think they're going to do, they've been talking about this for a year or two, but even if she raises interest rates from 0 to 0.25, it's still a quarter of what it was at 1. And she's talking about how even if we raise interest rates to a quarter of a percent, we're going to be really slow before we raise them again. I mean, they may never raise them again. So the degree to which the Fed has screwed up the economy this time, it's off the charts compared to 2008. And I think what makes everything so dangerous is not only does the Fed not have any clue about how its policies caused the 2008 financial crisis, they still don't understand what caused the Great Depression. They have learned the complete opposite lesson. The Federal Reserve made mistakes, but in the 1920s, those were the mistakes. In the latter half of the 1920s, the Federal Reserve kept interest rates too low. They did that deliberately. I mean, their goal was to try to prop up the British pound, and so they wanted to keep the pound from falling, so they lowered interest rates in the United States. But they shouldn't have done that. And by doing that, they created a speculative bubble in the stock market and in the real estate market. And eventually the Fed raised interest rates and pricked the bubble, and the bubble popped in 1929. But it wouldn't have been that big a deal. I mean, it probably would have gone on for a year. I mean, there wouldn't have been a Great Depression. But what happened is Herbert Hoover, who was the president at the time, decided that he didn't want to have a market-based approach, which had been the norm in the past. Normally, the free market, the government stayed out of it. And if there was tough times, the government did what everybody else did. The government tightened its belt. The government cut spending. If the economy was weak, you cut spending. You make yourself a smaller burden on a weaker economy, right? But instead, Hoover decided to be the first president to do a stimulus, and he tried to intervene. He tried to pop things up, and he ended up creating a depression, and then Roosevelt came in and expanded all those failed programs, and it became a Great Depression, right? So, but the way Ben Bernanke looks at the Depression, right, and the mistakes that were made, he thinks the mistake wasn't lowering interest rates, but the fact that they ever raised them. He thinks that, that the solution, and this is what the Fed thinks, that the solution to problems that are brought about by interest rates being too low and government spending too much is to make interest rates even lower and for the government to spend even more money. That's how you're supposed to solve these problems, right? If you're in a big ditch, you just keep digging, and that supposedly is going to get you out. So this is the mindset of Janet Yellen and her cohorts at the Federal Reserve. So it is a very scary position to be in, given what's about to happen. Because when the last crisis happened, yes, the Federal Reserve was able to bail everybody out and postpone a lot of the pain, because a lot of the bad debt that was owned by the private sector is now owned by the government. And the government's liabilities have just skyrocketed. And so the next step is going to be a crisis at the sovereign level, right? Not at the private level, but at the government level, where the U.S. government is going to go through a crisis in the dollar and in the bond market, where people are going to lose confidence in the value of the dollar and the U.S. government's ability to pay its debts with money that has value. Right now, people aren't worried about the fact that we have an $18.5 trillion debt because they know that we could print money to pay it, right? They're not worried. But at some point, they're going to have to worry about that. And it's not just $18.5 trillion. We owe, 100 trillion, I mean, whatever it is, if you count all the unfunded, off-budget type liabilities that are not part of the Treasury. But one of the reasons why the Federal Reserve has kept interest rates at zero is because if interest rates were allowed to rise, the U.S. government couldn't afford to service the debt, let alone retire it. Right? We're only spending about $250 billion or so a year on interest on the debt, even though the debt, is again approaching $20 trillion. By the time Barack Obama leaves office, the national debt will be about $20 trillion, which is about double what it was when he came into office. Right? Which means that President Obama actually would have added more to the national debt than George Washington to George W. Bush combined. But Bush did the same thing. Bush 43, he doubled the debt during his 8 years. So Obama doubled it again. So can Hillary possibly double it from 20 trillion to 40 trillion? Is that even possible? That's the trajectory that we're on. But is it even within the realm of possibility that we could do that? I don't think so. I think we're going to have a crisis in the bond market and the dollar long before that happens. The only reason that we've had this rally in the dollar is because the whole world is convinced that what the Federal Reserve did worked, right? That what the monetary policy that they pursued, fixed the problem, saved the economy, and that now the Fed can withdraw the stimulus. The Fed could raise interest rates, shrink its balance sheet, and everything is great. And because everybody believes that, they've bought the dollar. But the crisis is going to come when people realize that that's not the case. Right? The Federal Reserve didn't restore the economy to health. Right? They were saying, look, the economy needs a little help. Right? Just give it a crutch. Let the Federal Reserve, until the economy gets back on its feet, we'll give it this crutch. 0% interest rates, and then, when the economy is healthy again, we'll take it away. We won't need it anymore. That's not what actually happened, right? The economy didn't get a crutch. Basically, the Federal Reserve chopped off the legs and gave the economy prosthetics and quantitative easing and 0% interest rates. And that's the only thing that's supporting the economy. You can't take those prosthetics away. Then you can't walk. There's when people realize that all this is a bubble. Right, and Ben Bernanke wants to talk about, what a success my policy was, right? Well, how do we know it's a success? Interest rates are still at zero. You can't claim it's a success until you normalize those rates. Let the Fed bring interest rates back up to 5%. Let it take its balance sheet from $4.5 trillion back down to $1 trillion, and then tell me how successful the policy was. Because right now, all they've done is the easy part. Right? It's like, the easy part of drugs is getting addicted. Anybody can start taking drugs. Right? It's easy to start a bad habit. The hard part is giving it up. Right? Same thing, or, it's easy to gain a lot of weight. Right? You could talk about going on a diet, but do it. That's the hard part. Ben Bernanke and the Fed, they want to claim credit for fixing the economy when interest rates are still at zero. And if you actually look at what's happening in the real economy since the Fed embarked on this program, the economy is a mess. Real wages have fallen. The labor force has collapsed. Millions and millions of people have left the labor force. They're no longer working. Labor force participation has imploded. And not for the baby boom or the baby boom. In the last month, we got the jobs report that just came out for October, and everybody was so excited that we created 271,000 jobs. Yeah, all those jobs went to people 55 and older. People who were under 55 lost jobs. And I read that for males between the ages of 24 and 55, they lost 119,000 jobs in the month of October. So what's really going on is older Americans are taking temporary jobs because they can't afford to pay their electric bills because the costs have gone up, right? The cost of living is going up, and they don't have any interest on their CDs, so older Americans are coming out of retirement to take jobs that they don't want. And then you maybe have some married women with children who are forced to take a job because their husband can't afford to support them anymore. You don't have a real growing economy that is creating vibrant, productive jobs. We're in much worse shape than we were 8 years ago. Look at the average household net worth. Look at home ownership. Home ownership is at the lowest it's been in 50 years. 50 years. You know, most people now, they're renting, and the rents are rising rapidly, and they're going to continue to rise. And that's with the Federal Reserve. They got interest rates at 0, and you can buy a house with 3.5% down, guaranteed by the government with 3.5% down, and Americans are still too broke to qualify for that mortgage. What would happen to the housing market if interest rates went up? What would happen to housing prices? All those banks that were too big to fail, so we bailed them out, they're way bigger now. They would all fail if the Fed were to raise interest rates by any significant amount. They're all exposed. We have a gigantic automobile bubble. We've got a student loan bubble. Here I'm talking at a college, right? Look, what do we got? $1.3, $1.4 trillion now. Student debt is growing off the charts, even though college grads can't even get jobs. Why are they buying all this money when there's no jobs? You got college kids waiting tables, driving taxis, tending bar. You don't need to go to college for that. But I think a lot of the people who are borrowing money don't even care about the college. They just want the money, and going to school is the way to get it, because once you enroll, you can borrow the money. You use it to pay your rent, you can use it to buy groceries, but people are living off these college loans because there's no real productive economy beneath the surface. The Fed has just got this gigantic bubble. So what's going to happen is either the Fed doesn't raise interest rates at all in December and continues to pretend that there's some point in time where they're going to do it. And I think the reason that they talk about raising interest rates so much is because they know they can't. If they could raise them, they just would have done it. But because they can't do it, they talk about it. But the one thing the Federal Reserve can't admit is that they can't raise rates. Because if they admit that, then the party's over. Because that's an admission of failure. The whole idea is that this is temporary. But I remember when the Fed first announced their quantitative easing program, I said that was it. I said this was a monetary roach motel. I said in the beginning that once you check in, you never check out, right? And I said that there was going to be more quantitative easings than Rocky movies. This is when they did the first one, right? So they had 6 Rocky movies, and by the way, a 7th one is about to come out. Stallone just made another one with Apollo Creed's kid. So, we're going to have more QEs than those Rocky movies. And how did I know that? How did I know from the beginning that they would do so many? Because I knew it wouldn't work. And because it wouldn't work, they would do it again, right? Because that's how government is. It's like I describe it as you're trying to put out a fire with gasoline, right? And so you pour some gasoline on the fire, and then the fire gets bigger, and you think, gee, guess I didn't pour out enough gas. Let me get some more. And then they pour more gasoline, and, but the thing is eventually, they burn down the whole forest, right? That is where we're headed. So the Federal Reserve keeps pretending it's going to raise rates, but it doesn't do it because it must realize, oh my God, if we raise rates, that's the party's over. What happened when they raised rates before we got the financial crisis of 2008? This would be much worse. So they pretend. So either they never raise interest rates and the market figures it out, or they do raise interest rates. They feel, okay, we'll just raise it by 1/4 point. That's it, just 1/4 point, and then we'll promise not to do it again, right? They might do that. But either way, the dollar is going to start to fall. Buy the rumor, sell the fact, or maybe there's no fact to sell because it's all rumor, but this dollar bubble is going to burst. And as it starts to come down, it's going to start to force up commodity prices. Oil prices are going to go back up. Other prices are going to go back up. And the CPI is going to start to rise above the Fed's 2% level. And remember, the Federal Reserve said, well, if unemployment gets below 6.5%, we're going to raise rates. That's what they said years ago. And when they said that, I said, no, they won't. Right? I said they're lying. I don't care where unemployment goes, they're not going to raise rates. And sure enough, unemployment, the way they measure it, is now 5%, and they haven't raised rates. Well, I think the same thing is going to happen with inflation. They say, well, 2%, we get to 2.5%, we get to 3%. They're not going to raise rates. Why? Because they can't. Because we have too much debt. They don't want to bankrupt all these financial entities. But they're going to have to pretend, well, they're going to rationalize the inflation, or maybe it's transient, or they'll try to say that it's good for us. But the Fed's failure to raise rates and failure to deal with inflation is going to put more downward pressure on the dollar and accelerate the process. Meanwhile, you've got a lot of our creditors who have started already selling treasuries. The Chinese have sold over $100 billion worth of treasuries. Emerging market economies in South America and Southeast Asia, who accumulated trillions and trillions of dollars worth of U.S. treasuries in 2010, 2011, 2012. Remember that ridiculous currency war? Right, everybody was trying to stop their currency from rising as we were debasing ours, and in order to do that, they had to buy all these treasuries. Well, now that everybody thinks the Fed's about to raise rates, the dollar has risen and all those currencies have plunged. And now their governments have all these treasuries, which on paper have now appreciated in their own currency. What are they going to do? You got the Federal Reserve saying, well, we're going to raise rates. Well, if they do raise rates, in theory, what happens to bond prices? Bond prices fall. So if you're a foreign central bank and you've got these huge profits in these U.S. treasuries, you're going to take them, especially when you know that it's a gigantic Ponzi scheme, because you know that the government can never pay back any of that money, right? I mean, so the only way to get out is to sell. There's no redemption that's even possible. But I don't think that the foreign central banks that bought up all these dollars last time around, they're not going to fight currency World War II. They're going to let the dollar fall. And that means the dollar's decline is going to be much greater the next time around. And I think people are going to get the message, because we've already had this expansion has gone on for about 6 years. And the typical length of a U.S. economic expansion is maybe 5 years, I forget. But we're already beyond it, right? And yes, it is the weakest recovery ever. But I don't think it's going to be the longest, too. I have a pretty good feeling that by next year, we'll be in a recession. Maybe if the Fed does QE4 early enough next year, they can postpone that recession until after the 2006 elections. But that recession is coming. And when the dollar starts to fall, because we're not going to have all this support from foreign central banks, it'll fall quicker, and then we're going to start to deal with the inflation in consumer prices. A lot of people say, oh, Peter Schiff was wrong because he predicted that there'd be inflation and we haven't had any. Well, the people who say that don't understand what inflation is, because we've had plenty of inflation. Inflation is the expansion of the money supply, right? That's the literal definition of inflate. Get an old dictionary and look it up. That's where the word comes from, inflate. It's when you inflate something, you expand it. Well, what are we expanding? Prices don't expand. Prices go up and they go down, but you can't inflate a price because prices don't expand. It's money supply that expands and contracts. So the money supply has been inflated. And prices do rise as a result of that, but sometimes different prices. I said the stock market went way up. Why is it up? Is it because corporations are earning more money? No. Is it because the underlying plant and equipment is more valuable? No. In fact, U.S. plant and equipment is the oldest it's been in over 60 years. I mean, we've neglected our plant and equipment. The value of our real assets is going down, even as the stock price is going up. That's all inflation that's caused that. Same thing with real estate prices. Same thing with bond prices, right? I just read, again, on a paper, some guy in Japan just paid $170 million for a photograph of a naked woman. I forget who the artist was, but it was the second most expensive Modigliani. Second most expensive painting ever sold. Right? That price is way up. But sure, where's all that money coming from to bid up these art prices? So the Fed is creating inflation, but also consumer prices are rising. Forget the way the government wants to measure it. Look at your own bills. Everything is getting more expensive. And given the contraction in the economy, given how weak the economy is, why aren't prices falling? Why doesn't somebody ask that question? During the Great Depression of the 1930s, prices went down by 30%, and thank God for that. Imagine how much worse the depression would have been if prices went up. Prices going down relieves. People say, oh, we need more consuming. There's not enough lower prices. That's how you get more demand, lower prices. Right? This is a university. They teach economics. Right? The most basic concept of economics is supply and demand. And that's a law. And what does supply and demand say? The lower the price, the greater the demand. But the Federal Reserve thinks it's the other way around. They think it's high prices that create demand. No, it's low prices. So if there's not enough of demand, prices need to come down. And then people can afford to buy things. But no one asks, hey, why aren't prices falling? What's preventing prices from coming down? Inflation is preventing them from coming down. The government is robbing people. The Federal Reserve is robbing consumers of the benefit of lower prices. That's still inflation. But one of the reasons that the inflation that the Federal Reserve creates is not runaway inflation is because a lot of that money is offshore, owned by foreign central banks. And what do they buy with their excess dollars? They buy treasuries. They buy bonds. That's why bond prices are up in the stratosphere. But how does this work, right? The Federal Reserve prints money, and we use it to buy stuff. We buy real things, real products that you need factories to produce. Actual labor. People are sitting in a factory doing something, that requires skill, and they're making us a product. And what do they get in exchange for it? A piece of paper. Doesn't take any effort on our part to print up money, but it took a lot of effort to manufacture a consumer good. And we run $500 billion a month, a $500 billion a year trade deficits, right? And so that's keeping prices down, right? Because we get to export our inflation. Inflation is America's biggest export, right? And we import real things. And the crazy part about it is economists look at this and think, that somehow that, the world is somehow better off for this. That we're getting the short end of the stick, because we have these deficits. But the world is getting nothing. I mean, we suckered them into giving us all their stuff for the money that we print. But when they lose confidence in that, when they realize, wait a minute, the Fed is stuck, the Fed can't raise interest rates, and in fact, if we've just gone through this 6-year or 7-year, whatever it's going to be, if we go from recession to recovery and back to recession, and the Fed has got interest rates at zero the entire time, that's going to show people that this is the new normal, that we are now so addicted to cheap money that even during a recovery, the Fed can't raise rates. That the only thing the Fed can do during the business cycle is alter the amount of quantitative easing. So when the economy is in recession, they print a bunch of money, and when it comes out of recession, they print less, right? But interest rates have to stay at zero the whole time because they can no longer raise them, right? It's like the economy, like I use drugs, but we have such a bad drug habit. We need so much drugs at this point that even if they take a little bit away, we're going to go through economic convulsions. So when our creditors, our international creditors realize this, they will lose confidence in the dollar, and they're not going to want to warehouse dollars. They're going to realize that, hey, if we just sit on these dollars for 5 or 10 or 20 years, they might not be worth anything. So they're not going to want our dollars in exchange for their products. And so that's going to mean that the inflation that we create stays here, right? If we can't export our dollars, if the dollar is falling in value and Americans can't use their dollars to buy foreign products, what are we going to buy? What products? I mean, it's not like we make the products ourselves. One of the things Donald Trump wants to do is, let's put these big tariffs. Well, I mean, tariffs could work in theory if you got an industry to protect. But once your industry is gone, I mean, what good are the tariffs going to do? It's just going to raise prices because there is no American substitute. Most of these products that we import are not made here. It is you can't make them without a factory. You can't make them without labor that actually knows how to operate the machines. 70% of our so-called GDP is people just spending money, shopping. And I read these articles about it, how they actually define shopping as economic output. 70% of U.S. economic output is consumer spending. What do you put out when you spend money? Nothing. Right? Anybody can spend money. The output is what you the products that you produce, not when you just consume what has already been produced. Yeah, what Americans do is we consume what other people produced. The economic growth takes place outside the United States. We just borrow the money to pay for the stuff. So when foreigners lose confidence in the dollar, then the dollar is going to collapse, and all that inflation that we exported is going to come back. And then all the people that said, oh, guys like Peter Schiff or the Austrians, see, they said, oh, we were wrong because there's no inflation. We were right. They just don't know it yet. But by the time that inflation tsunami washes back up on our shore, it's too late to do anything about it. And you can't do anything about it. That's it, right? That genie is far out of the bottle. But if you just focus on the consumer price and not understand everything that's going on, you can be led to make the false conclusion that, hey, we can print all this money and there's no negative consequences. So let's just keep printing more, right? That's kind of what the Federal Reserve looks at. They print all this money, interest rates aren't going up, consumer prices aren't going up. Oh, I guess I can keep printing more. There's no ill effect. But if all of this happens with a big lag, and the reason the lag is longer is because of this international trip. The U.S. dollar is the reserve currency, and so it's going to take a long time for all this bad monetary policy to really blow up on us. But in the meantime, as I said, you can see the results on a smaller scale in the real economy, where the average American is suffering a decline in their standard of living, that we're not getting the savings and investment necessary for legitimate economic growth. And so instead, we substitute this bubble economy and we try to convince Americans to take on more debt and buy more stuff. And how have we done that? With the auto bubble, right? Americans are borrowing all this money to buy cars they can't afford. Now car loans are like 7-8 years. People are taking out mortgages to buy cars. And that's with 0% financing, right? Everything people are buying, it's all on credit, right? And this is what's keeping it going. But there is a limit to how much credit people can take on. And at some point, of course, it's the lenders that impose a hard limit because they begin to realize that they can't get paid back. And when it comes to our global creditors, again, it's purchasing power that counts. Any sovereign that borrows in its own currency can repay its debts if the creditors don't care what the value of the money is. Right? I don't think the Zimbabwe government defaulted on any of its bonds. It just paid them off in full. Who cares? Right? And there are plenty of situations where governments have borrowed in their own currency and then, printed it. But people have given the United States a lot of slack in just assuming that we would right the ship and that we would one day, come to terms with the debt. But I think it's because we've been able to get away with it for so long, there is no political will in Congress, the White House, or the Fed to actually do anything about the debt. Yeah, it's good talking. You're going to have the Republican debate is going to be on Fox later today. And all the candidates are going to talk about, yeah, I want a balanced budget. Yeah, all these candidates. When I ran for Senate, it was the same thing. All the candidates want to talk about a balanced budget amendment. We don't need a balanced budget amendment. Just don't raise the debt ceiling. That's all you have to do, right? And then that's a balanced budget. But the reason that they all want to say I'm for a balanced budget amendment is because there is no balanced budget amendment to be for. Anybody can be for that because no one ever has to vote for it. But what they do have to vote for is a debt ceiling raise. And they do that every time. And they just did it. So when our creditors realize that, look, there is no solution to our debt problem. It's just more debt. The government is never going to prick this bubble on its own. The government is not going to restructure or admit that it's broke. It's just going to keep on adding. Look, we're already broke, and we added Obamacare. Right, we're bankrupt from our Social Security liabilities, from our Medicare liabilities. We have an enormous debt, and then we just added Obamacare on top of that, right? And now they want more, right? I mean, look, you got, Bernie Sanders wants college to be completely free. Imagine how expensive it's going to be when it's completely free. Look at how expensive it is now because of the government. But, so the fact that we're just going this way, it can only end in a currency crisis. And I'll wind it up because I know I want to take questions. I'm not, but when the dollar collapses because the Fed is unable to raise interest rates, unable to fight inflation, and of course, if the Federal Reserve belatedly does the right thing, that's a big if. If they end up raising interest rates sharply, by the time the Fed raises rates, they're not going to raise them a quarter of a point. They're going to have to do it Volcker style, right? Maybe worse, right? Russia had to raise interest rates to 17%, I don't know, 6 months ago. The ruble was falling. They raised interest rates to 17%. The Russian economy is still there. Can you imagine the American economy if we had to raise interest rates to 17%? What would it be like? See, if they have to raise interest rates even to 5%, we're going to collapse. Right? And not only will all the banks fail, but the depositors are going to lose their money. See, in the '08 crisis, if nobody lost any money, no creditors. Not forget about depositors. If you owned a bond, if you owned from a bank, you didn't lose. The government bailed out the bank and nobody lost any money. But if the Federal Reserve has to raise interest rates to defend the dollar, nobody can get a bailout. You can't bail anybody out if the Fed is raising rates, right? That's the opposite of bailing out. There's no money. The Congress has no money. If the Fed is raising rates and selling Treasuries, right, shrinking its balance sheet, right, nobody gets bailed out. So not only will the bondholders lose money, the depositors will lose money because the FDIC has no money. There's nothing there. And in fact, if the Federal Reserve has to raise interest rates to fight inflation, the U.S. government has to default on the Treasury bonds. They're not going to have the money to pay the interest. Certainly, a third of the U.S. Treasury bond market matures in the next year. What happens if our creditors want their money back? We don't have it. The government counts on everybody rolling it over, right? That's why, when they first put, Bernie Madoff in jail, they interviewed him. And I think it was the New York Times interviewed him. And he said to the New York Times, I don't know why you guys are making a big deal about me. I mean, I'm a piker. I mean, the federal U.S. government is running a much bigger Ponzi scheme than I did, right? And when that article first came out, people dismissed it, right? They said, what does he know? He's Bernie Madoff, right? And I said, well, he knows one thing, right? Ponzi schemes, right? He knows one when he sees one. He has credibility there. And that's why I said, look, why do we have the guy in jail? We should just make it. Because he understands how to deal with a Ponzi scheme. Because the clowns in Washington, they even admit it's a Ponzi scheme, right? What do they say? What did they just say a few weeks ago? If we don't raise the debt ceiling, we're going to default. That's an admission that it's a Ponzi scheme, right? And it's basic Ponzi 101. If you are running a Ponzi scheme, don't tell anybody, right? You got to keep it quiet. But we've told everybody it's a Ponzi scheme, so they know. So if the Fed raises interest rates, the U.S. Treasury has to default. People that have bank accounts are going to lose their money, and the government's going to have to come clean with Social Security recipients, pensioners, military pension, government civilian pension, and say, you know what, we promised you a lot of money to get your votes, but we spent that money, and now we're broke, so we can't give you what we promised. That's what would happen. If the U.S. Federal Reserve did the right thing and raised interest rates to stop the dollar from becoming monopoly money, the government is going to have to be honest about the financial situation and not pay people their dollars. Now, if they don't do that, then we're going to have a complete collapse of the dollar. And yes, you go to the bank, you'll get your money. If you're expecting a Social Security check, it'll be in the mail, right? But you're not going to be able to buy much with it. See, there is no easy way out. If you borrow beyond your capacity to repay, the debts aren't paid. You can be honest about it and default, or you can be dishonest and inflate. But either way, the consequences are the same. The creditor doesn't get his money because the borrower is broke. So either you get your money and it doesn't buy you anything, or you get less money. Now, personally, I think our creditors would be better off if they got less money, if they took a haircut, if we had a legitimate restructuring and the government paid the bondholders 30 cents on the dollar, if the government paid Social Security recipients 30 cents on the dollar or whatever, or maybe they just means tested it and asset tested it and said, look, if you have money, if you have wealth, you're not getting any Social Security, but if you're destitute, well, you're going to get something, and like welfare. I mean, they can have different ways to default on these commitments, but I think if they did that, people would be much better off than politicians trying to pay everybody off with a printing press. Because then I think the real loss in purchasing power will be much greater. Yes, maybe you get 100 cents on the dollar, but maybe your 100 cents is worth 2 cents, right? That's a much bigger haircut than what would be the case if the government were to be honest. But hopefully, in the aftermath of this monetary crisis that is coming, we can finally learn from our mistakes and start over, right? Get rid of the Fed, take the power away from Congress. America became the wealthiest country in the history of the world without a central bank. We were on a gold standard. I mean, we didn't have a central bank until 1913, right? We went through the Industrial Revolution without a central bank. And yes, the momentum carried us through to the Second World War. But as the bank has grown and the government has grown in tandem with the Federal Reserve, our wealth has been dramatically diminished. We're no longer the world's wealthiest economy. We're the world's biggest debtor. Our economy is a complete disaster. And so hopefully, rather than what happened in 2008, see, in 2008, the government was successful in its PR campaign or propaganda campaign. The government actually blamed that crisis on capitalism. They said, we didn't have enough regulation. It was capitalism run amok, too much greed. The solution was more government. The Federal Reserve actually got more power as a result of the financial crisis, even though they created it, right? So hopefully when it blows up again, the government won't be able to blame the free market or what's left of it, And that is one of the successes of government is they infiltrate the free market, they screw stuff up, and then when their intervention causes a problem, they blame it on the free market. And they say, you see, this proves we need even more government. And then they get more government, and then they screwed up more. So hopefully this next crisis, enough people will understand the root cause of it, and we can have a backlash and go back to sound money and limited government and kind of reboot the economy and start over again. And believe me, we're in a big hole because of 50 years of this nonsense, because of going off the gold standard and what this has done. But the good news is that capitalism works, and if we could get rid of enough government, with all the technology that we have today that we didn't have 100 years ago, I mean, if America could be so successful in the 19th century with capitalism, imagine how successful we can be in the 21st century with the technology that exists today. Imagine how much better capitalism would work. Imagine how much more rapidly we can raise the standard of living of our people if the government would simply get out of the way and let it happen. Thank you. All right, so.
Thank you, Mr. Schiff. We have time for one really good question.
That's it? One question? I only spoke for 45 minutes. Or no, I started 4. I spoke for an hour. Oh, all right.
Mr. Schiff, thank you so much for your time this evening. I'm going to go back to your talk about the Federal Reserve, and there's been a lot of proposals right now on the floor of Congress to audit the Fed. 3-part question. So, first of all, who should audit the Fed? What should they look at when they audit the Fed? And then finally, what do we do about it after they do? Thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, I was saying, auditing the Fed isn't even enough. I mean, just, but it would make sense for it to be a little bit more transparent. So the whole idea is to find out what exactly the Fed is doing, because they're very secretive. How much money are they creating and what are they buying? Because the Federal Reserve, you just let them buy whatever they want. I mean, right now they're buying, not only are they buying treasuries, they're buying mortgages, they're buying consumer debt. I mean, you don't really want to allow an agent of government, which is really, look, the Federal Reserve is supposed to be a private bank, right? But in fact, it acts as if it was an arm of the government, and that's not what it's supposed to do. But if they can just print money and buy stuff, I mean, that's like nationalization. That's like the government just confiscating wealth. I mean, what's to stop the Federal Reserve from buying stocks, buying real estate? They can buy up the whole country, right? In fact, they're actually talking about doing that in Japan. They might end up doing that here, right? So I think auditing the Fed would be a good idea just to kind of have a little bit better understanding of what's going on behind closed doors. But what really has to happen is and it's not only just eliminating the Fed, but eliminating the functions. Because I don't want Congress to just do what the Fed is doing. What the Fed is doing shouldn't be done at all. And interest rates need to be determined by the market, not by a group of men behind a closed door. I mean, does anybody think, interest rates are at zero. How can that possibly be the correct price? Zero. How can that be? Right? Would the market set interest rates at zero? Think about it too. Nobody is saving in America and everybody is borrowing. So interest rates should be high. Plus, we've got lots of debt. The more debt you have, the greater the chances are that you're not going to pay it back. So when interest rates go up, the market stops you from borrowing. Right? That's how the market works. Right? If there's a shortage of savings, then interest rates go up. That encourages more savings. If people have too much debt, interest rates go up, and that stops the borrowing. The market works. It doesn't work when the government comes in and sets a price. Just like, look, we don't want the government to set the price of bread, because then there'd be shortages. There'd be long lines. Yeah, they had that in the Soviet Union, right? For a while, they controlled the price of gasoline, and we had to wait in line for gasoline because they didn't let the market function. Right? Well, they said they have a minimum wage. So that means if you can't convince somebody to pay you the minimum wage, you're legally unemployable. Now they want to raise it. They want to throw more people out of work. Let the market set prices. But probably the most important price in the economy is interest rates, and it needs to be set by the market. And also money. Money needs to have value. It can't just be a piece of paper. Money was created to replace barter, right? Where I gave you a chicken for a pig, right? Everybody got something of value. Well, the concept of money was that, hey, gold has value, but it's easier to trade. If I want a pig, I don't have to find somebody who wants a chicken. I could just pay him gold because everybody wants gold. So money started as a commodity. It was a commodity that was used as money. Any commodity can theoretically be money, but gold works better than all the other commodities. And that's why it became money for thousands of years. But what we got now isn't money. It's a substitute, but it doesn't work. It's just a piece of paper. Right? And initially, we talk about the Federal Reserve. Federal Reserve notes were backed 40% by gold, and they were redeemable 100% in gold and silver. If you had a $20 bill in 1913, it was redeemable. It wasn't a $20 bill. It was a $20 Federal Reserve note, payable. It was an IOU for $20. Right? It was a note, which is a debt instrument. Right? That's why they're called Federal Reserve notes, because it's a debt. It's a liability of the Federal Reserve. And what did the Federal Reserve owe you? They owed you $20. What was $20? An ounce of gold. That's what you were owed if you owned a Federal Reserve note. What do you own now if you have a Federal Reserve note? Nothing. What does the Federal Reserve promise to pay you for a $20 bill? Nothing. 2 10s, 4 5s. You don't get anything. I don't even know why they call it a note. Yes, it's technically a liability on their balance sheet, but they're not liable for anything. They don't have to pay you anything. It's not real money. It was supposed to be real money, but it isn't anymore. It's no different than monopoly money. Next question.
Thank you, Mr. Schiff.
Yeah.